The schoolhouse door crashed open with such force that chalk dust exploded from the blackboard like gun smoke. Jonas Cutter stood there 6'4" of weathered muscle and determination, his shadow swallowing the afternoon light. "Miss Walker," his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons to guard your winters." Abigail's lesson book slipped from her frozen fingers. In that moment, her carefully ordered world of primers and poetry, of lonely evenings and resigned solitude, shattered like glass. Friends, let me tell you how a desperate bargain became the greatest love story Redfern Ridge ever witnessed. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below. I want to know how far this tale of unlikely love has traveled. The autumn of 1882 painted Redfern Ridge in shades of copper and gold, but Abigail Walker saw none of its beauty as she dismissed her students that October afternoon. 20 pairs of boots thundered across the wooden floor, racing toward freedom, leaving her alone with the settling dust and the weight of another empty evening ahead. At 33, she had long since stopped checking her reflection in windows, stopped wondering if her brown hair still held hints of auburn in the sunlight, stopped caring that her hands bore more ink stains than rings. "Miss Walker always stays late," little Emma Hartley whispered to her brother as they gathered their slate boards. "Mama says it's because she has nowhere else to go." The words weren't meant to wound, but they pierced Abigail's heart with surgical precision. She bent over her desk, pretending to grade papers she'd already marked twice, waiting for the last echoes of childish laughter to fade beyond the schoolyard fence. The silence that followed was her constant companion, not peaceful, but heavy like a wool blanket in summer. She had just begun organizing tomorrow's arithmetic lesson when the door exploded inward. Jonas Cutter had to duck to enter the schoolhouse, his broad shoulders barely clearing the frame. Sawdust clung to his work shirt, and his hands, massive callous things that could snap fence posts like kindling, hung awkwardly at his sides, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do with them in such a delicate space. His face, tanned to leather by countless seasons under the prairie sun, bore the kind of lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder living. "Mr. Cutter," Abigail managed her voice, catching slightly. She knew him, of course. Everyone in Redfern Ridge knew Jonas Cutter. He owned the largest ranch for 50 miles in any direction, employed half the town in one way or another, and had buried his wife 3 winters past. "Is there something wrong with the Morrison boys?" They were in class today. "Nothing's wrong with my ranch hands, boys." He cut her off, his voice deep as a well. "I'm here about you." Abigail's hand instinctively moved to her throat. I don't understand." Jonas took 3 strides forward. That's all it took for him to cross the entire room and stood before her desk like a mountain that had decided to pay a social call. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with hints of blue when the light caught them just right. "I'll speak plain, Miss Walker, because I don't know any other way." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with premature silver. "My ranch needs a woman's hand. My business needs a hostess for the buyers from back east. And I need—" He paused, something almost vulnerable flickering across his weathered features. "I need someone who won't look at me with pity every time they remember Sarah's gone." Abigail's mouth opened, but no words emerged. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the pine floor she'd swept 1,000 times. "You're 33. Jonas continued, as if reciting facts about cattle prices. "No suitors calling, no family within 500 miles. You spend every Sunday in church alone every evening in that boarding house room Mrs. Pritchard says is barely bigger than a pantry. You're educated, respectable, and strong enough to handle frontier life. You've proved that much already." Each word was true, each observation accurate, and each one stung like a nettle. Abigail stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her desk, until her knuckles went white. "Mr. Cutter, if you've come here to catalog my failings as a woman—" "I've come to offer you a proposition," he interrupted, his tone neither cruel nor kind, simply matter of fact. "Marriage. Not the kind young girls dream about with flowers and poetry, but the real kind. Partnership, protection, purpose." He set his hat on one of the small student desks where it looked absurdly large. "I need a wife, Miss Walker. And you, whether you admit it or not, need strong sons to guard your winters." The phrase hung in the air between them like a challenge. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from anger or something else she couldn't say. "You speak of marriage like it's a business transaction," she said quietly. "Because that's what it would be," Jonas replied without hesitation. "I'm not a man who trades in false promises, Miss Walker. I'm not going to court you with wildflowers and moonlight walks. I'm not going to pretend I'm offering love when what I'm offering is security. You'd have my name, my protection, and my respect. The ranch house has 8 rooms and indoor plumbing. You'd never want for anything material. In return, you'd run the household host when necessary, and—" He paused again, seeming to struggle with the next words. "And perhaps in time we might find ourselves with children who need teaching." Abigail sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. Through the window she could see the town spreading out below the schoolhouse hill, the general store where she bought her meager supplies, the church where she sat alone each Sunday, the boarding house where she'd spent 6 years listening to other people's lives through thin walls. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Surely there are younger women, prettier women." "Younger women want romance," Jonas said bluntly. "Prettier women have options. You're practical, Miss Walker. You understand loneliness. You won't expect what I can't give, and you won't resent me for what I am, a man who buried his heart with his first wife and has only duty left to offer." The honesty of it was brutal, yet somehow refreshing. How many times had she watched marriages built on elaborate promises crumble when reality set in? How many of her former students' mothers whispered about husbands who'd promised them the moon but delivered only hardship? "You don't know me," Abigail said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "You see a spinster schoolteacher and assume you know my story, my needs, my dreams." "I know you read until midnight because Mrs. Pritchard complains about your lamp oil usage," Jonas interrupted. "I know you send half your salary to an orphanage in St. Louis because Tom at the post office mentioned it once. I know you taught yourself Latin because I've seen the books you order from Denver. And I know you're lonely enough that you sometimes stop at the cemetery just to read the headstones, looking for stories of people you never met." Abigail's breath caught. She hadn't known anyone had noticed her cemetery visits, those twilight moments when she'd trace the carved names of strangers and wonder about their lives, their loves, their losses. "You've been watching me," she said, though it came out more like a question. "I've been considering you," Jonas corrected. "For 3 months now, since the harvest dance where you stood by the punch bowl all night pretending to be busy with the refreshments so no one would notice you weren't dancing." The memory of that night, the music, the laughter, the careful smile she'd maintained while measuring out cups of cider for couples who barely noticed her, made her chest tight. "This is absurd," she said, standing again, beginning to pace the small space between the desk and the blackboard. "You can't simply walk into my schoolhouse and propose marriage like you're negotiating for cattle." "Why not?" Jonas asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his tone. "At least I'm honest about what this is. How many men court women with pretty lies, then reveal their true nature after the vows are spoken? I'm telling you exactly what you'd be getting: a business arrangement with personal benefits, security for companionship, protection for partnership." He moved to the window, his large frame blocking out the late afternoon light. "My first marriage was love," he said quietly. Sarah was. She was sunshine in a dress, laughter at breakfast songs while she worked. When the fever took her, it nearly took me, too. I won't survive that again, Miss Walker. I can't offer you love because I don't have it to give. But I can offer you something perhaps more valuable: absolute honesty and unwavering loyalty. Abigail found herself moving toward him, drawn by something in his voice, not vulnerability exactly, but a kind of stark humanity that resonated with her own carefully hidden pain. "And if I said yes," she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. "What then?" Jonas turned to face her, and for the first time since he'd entered, something that might have been surprise crossed his features. "Then we'd marry within the month. You'd move to the ranch, you'd have your own room, your own space. I wouldn't impose. We'd build a partnership slow and steady, like raising a barn, and maybe in time we'd find we suit each other better than either of us expected. Or maybe we'd discover we'd made a terrible mistake," Abigail countered. "Maybe," Jonas agreed, "but at least it would be an honest mistake, not one built on illusions and false promises." They stood there barely 3 feet apart, the air between them charged with possibility and pragmatism in equal measure. Abigail could smell the leather of his work gloves, the faint scent of hay, and horses that clung to him, the smell of hard work, and open spaces so different from the chalk dust and ink that defined her world. "I need time to think," she said finally. Jonas nodded, picking up his hat. "Fair enough. But don't think too long, Miss Walker. Winter's coming, and neither of us is getting younger." He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's a dance at the Grange Hall this Saturday. If you're there, I'll know your answer is maybe. If you're not," he shrugged, "then I'll know that too." He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, the door closing behind him with a definitive click. Abigail stood alone in the schoolhouse, her heart pounding, her mind racing, her carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. She moved to her desk and sat down heavily, pulling out a piece of paper and her pen. She'd always found clarity in writing and setting thoughts to paper where they could be examined and organized. But now the blank page stared back at her as vast and terrifying as the prairie itself. "Dear," she began, then stopped. Dear who she had no one to write to, no confidant to help her parse through this impossible proposition. Her parents were 10 years dead, her only sister lost to childbirth 5 years past. The few friends she'd made in Redfern Ridge were cordial acquaintances at best, women who included her in quilting circles out of duty rather than affection. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if she'd had someone to share them with. She could hear the distant sound of the evening stage arriving, bringing news from the wider world that always felt so far from her small corner of existence. The next 3 days passed in a blur of routine that felt suddenly foreign. Abigail taught her lessons: arithmetic, reading, geography. But her mind kept wandering to Jonas Cutter's proposition. She found herself studying the married women in town with new eyes, wondering about their bargains, their compromises, their secret disappointments, and unexpected joys. On Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Marcus Blackwell swept into the schoolhouse just as classes ended. Regina Blackwell was everything Abigail was not: blonde, beautiful, and brimming with the confidence that came from being desired. She was also married to Jonas Cutter's chief rival, a man who'd been trying to buy out the Cutter Ranch since Sarah's death. "Miss Walker's," Regina purred, her silk dress rustling as she pretended to examine the children's artwork hanging on the walls. "I heard the most interesting gossip at the Mercantile." Abigail continued cleaning the blackboard, refusing to give Regina the satisfaction of her attention. "I don't trade in gossip, Mrs. Blackwell." "Oh, but this concerns you directly," Regina continued, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "They say Jonas Cutter was seen entering the schoolhouse after hours, alone, with you." The chalk in Abigail's hand snapped. She turned slowly to face the other woman. Mr. Cutter had business to discuss regarding the Morrison boys' education. "Nothing more." Regina's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "Oh, my dear, you don't have to pretend with me, though I must say I'm surprised Jonas would lower himself to—" She gestured vaguely at Abigail, taking in her simple dress, her work-worn hands, her unremarkable features. "Well, to this. Then again, men do have certain needs, and I suppose even Jonas Cutter must get lonely." The implication hung in the air like a slap. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "If you have something to say, Mrs. Blackwell, say it plainly. Otherwise, I have work to do." "I'm simply offering friendly advice," Regina said, moving toward the door with studied grace. "Jonas Cutter is not a man to be trifled with, and neither is my husband. If Jonas is sniffing around you, it's not for your charm or beauty. We both know you possess neither in abundance. He wants something, and men like him always get what they want one way or another. Just ask his first wife." "Sarah Cutter died of fever," Abigail said coldly. "Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what Jonas Cutter wants them to know," Regina replied, pausing at the door. "But those of us who've been here longer remember things. How Sarah begged to go back east to her family. How Jonas refused. How convenient that fever was taking her just when she'd threatened to leave without his permission." She smiled, showing too many teeth. "But I'm sure you know what you're doing, Miss Walker. After all, a woman of your limited prospects can't afford to be choosy." She left in a swirl of silk and French perfume, leaving Abigail shaking with rage and something else, doubt. Was there truth to Regina's poison, or was it merely the venom of a woman whose husband coveted what Jonas possessed? That evening, Abigail found herself at the boarding house dinner table, pushing food around her plate, while Mrs. Pritchard and the other boarders chattered about inconsequential things. Her room afterward felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. She tried to read, but found her eyes sliding over the words without comprehension. Finally, she pulled out paper and began to write. Not a letter this time, but lists. Reasons to accept. Security. Respectability. A home of my own. The possibility of children. Escape from this crushing loneliness. Honest arrangement. No false expectations. Reasons to refuse. No love. Regina's warnings. The fear of trading one prison for another. My independence such as it is. The unknown nature of Jonas's true character. The finality of it. She stared at the lists until the words blurred. Then on impulse she added one more item to the first list. He noticed I visit the cemetery. It was such a small thing, yet somehow it mattered. In 6 years no one else had noticed, or if they had, they hadn't cared enough to mention it. Jonas Cutter, for all his bluntness, had been paying attention. Friday dawned gray and cold with the kind of wind that cut through wool as if it were cotton. Abigail taught her lessons mechanically, her mind elsewhere. During the lunch break, she overheard 2 of her older students talking. Pa says Mr. Cutter's going to lose the north pasture to Mr. Blackwell, Tommy Morrison said, unwrapping his sandwich. Says Mr. Blackwell's got some paper that proves it was never really Mr. Cutter's land to begin with. That's a lie, his brother Jake shot back. Mr. Cutter's owned that land since before we were born. Mr. Blackwell's just jealous because Mr. Cutter's ranch is bigger and better. Pa says Mr. Cutter's vulnerable now without a wife, Tommy insisted. Says a man alone is easy prey for vultures like Blackwell. Abigail's hand stilled on her own lunch. Was that part of Jonas's reasoning? Did he need a wife? Not just for companionship, but for protection against those who would see a widower as weak. The thought should have offended her, being wanted as a shield rather than for herself. But instead it oddly comforted her. She understood being useful. She'd built her entire life around it. That afternoon, as her students filed out, young Emma Hartley lingered behind. The 8-year-old approached Abigail's desk with the solemnity of someone bearing important news. Miss Walker, she said quietly, my mama wants you to know something. Abigail knelt to the child's level. What is it, Emma? She says to tell you that Mr. Cutter is a good man. She says he was real gentle with Mrs. Sarah when she was sick, and he held her hand until the very end. Mama was there. She helped nurse Mrs. Sarah. She says don't believe everything Mrs. Blackwell says because Mrs. Blackwell is mean and tells lies. The child delivered this message with careful precision, then added on her own, I think Mr. Cutter is nice. He gave me a peppermint once when I was crying because Tommy Morrison pulled my braids. Before Abigail could respond, Emma was gone, running to catch up with her brother. Abigail stood slowly, her heart doing strange things in her chest. Mrs. Hartley was a midwife, a woman who'd seen birth and death in equal measure. If she vouched for Jonas Cutter's character, that carried weight. Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the prairie grass look like spun gold. Abigail spent the morning in an agony of indecision. She pulled out her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out what little color her eyes possessed, then put it away, then pulled it out again. Going somewhere special? Mrs. Pritchard asked, catching Abigail ironing the dress in the communal kitchen. The Grange Hall dance? Abigail replied, keeping her voice neutral. Mrs. Pritchard's eyebrows rose to her hairline. You never go to the dances. Perhaps it's time I did. The older woman studied her with shrewd eyes. This wouldn't have anything to do with Jonas Cutter's visit to the schoolhouse, would it? Abigail's iron paused for just a moment. I don't know what you mean. Child, I've run this boarding house for 15 years. I know every bit of gossip in this town before the gossips themselves do. Mrs. Pritchard moved closer, lowering her voice. Jonas Cutter is a hard man, but he's a fair one. He pays his debts, keeps his word, and treats his workers well. His first wife was fragile as spun glass, beautiful, yes, but not made for frontier life. You're different. You're strong steel wrapped in cotton. That might be exactly what a man like him needs. He doesn't love me, Abigail found herself saying. Love? Mrs. Pritchard laughed, but not unkindly. Child, I've been married 3 times. My first husband I loved with all the passion of youth. He drank himself to death within 2 years. My second husband I married for security. He gave me 15 good years before the cholera took him. My third husband, God rest him. I married for companionship and found love growing slow and steady like an oak tree. Sometimes love comes first, sometimes it comes last, and sometimes it comes not at all. But respect partnership kindness, those you can build on. That evening, Abigail stood before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman looking back. The green dress did things for her figure she'd forgotten were possible. She'd pinned her hair up in a style she'd seen in a magazine from Denver, leaving a few tendrils to curl around her face. She wasn't beautiful, would never be beautiful, but she looked presentable, purposeful, like a woman who might run a ranch house instead of just a classroom. The walk to the Grange Hall felt both endless and far too short. She could hear the music from a block away, fiddle and accordion mixing with laughter and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Inside the hall was transformed. Lanterns cast golden light over the dancing couples, and the air smelled of apple cider and fresh bread. Abigail stood in the doorway scanning the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she saw him. Jonas Cutter stood near the far wall, dressed in a black suit that must have cost more than she made in 3 months. He was talking to Tom Bradley from the bank, but his eyes were on the door. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or maybe relief. He excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room with those long, purposeful strides. The crowd seemed to part before him, and Abigail was aware of the sudden hush, the turning heads, the whispers that followed in his wake. "Miss Walker," he said when he reached her and offered his arm, "would you honor me with a dance?" Abigail had not danced in 6 years. She'd forgotten the weight of a man's hand at her waist, the warmth of another palm pressed against hers. Jonas led her onto the floor with surprising grace for such a large man, and suddenly they were moving to the music, the world spinning around them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But you're here. I'm here." They danced in silence for a moment, and Abigail became aware of the solid strength of him, the way he guided her without forcing, led without dominating. Around them, other couples continued dancing, but she could feel the weight of their attention. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them," Jonas replied. "They'll have to get used to it if you say yes." "You're very confident." "No," he said, and there was something raw in his voice. "I'm hopeful. There's a difference." The song ended, but Jonas didn't release her. Instead, he led her toward the doors that opened onto the small terrace behind the hall. The night air was cool against her heated skin, and the stars spread above them like scattered diamonds. "I should tell you," Jonas said, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Marcus Blackwell has been spreading rumors about you, about my intentions. He thinks if he can scandalize you enough, I'll withdraw my offer, and he can continue his campaign to force me to sell." "And would you," Abigail asked, "withdraw your offer if I became a scandal?" "No." The word was flat final. "But you should know what you're walking into. Blackwell wants my land. He'll use any weapon he can find, including you." "I'm not afraid of Marcus Blackwell," Abigail said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "You should be," Jonas said seriously. "He's dangerous when cornered, and marrying me would corner him." "Then why?" "Because I'm tired of being alone." Jonas interrupted the word, seeming to surprise him as much as her. "Because I see you in that schoolhouse day after day, pouring yourself into those children who aren't yours, going home to empty rooms, and I think we're both wasting our lives on isolation when we could build something together." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "Not Sarah's. I buried her ring with her. This one came from Ireland with my mother when she was just 17. She built a life from nothing in a new country with a man she'd never met before her wedding day. They had 43 years together before she died. Not all of them were happy, but none of them were wasted. Abigail stared at the ring, this tangible symbol of the momentous choice before her. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I have conditions." Jonas's mouth quirked in what might have been approval. "Name them." "I continue teaching until we have children of our own to raise." "Agreed." "I want my own space, my own room, until—" She paused, heat rising to her cheeks, "until we both decide otherwise." "Agreed." "And I want honesty, complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurts." "That," Jonas said, "I can promise without reservation." Abigail took a breath that seemed to come from her very soul. "Then yes," she said, "yes, I'll marry you." Jonas didn't smile. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen him truly smile, but something in his face softened. He took the ring from the box and reached for her hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, infinitely gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. 3 weeks, he said. "We'll marry in 3 weeks. That should give you time to settle your affairs and give the gossips something to chew on." 3 weeks. Abigail agreed, the weight of the ring foreign on her finger. They stood there for a moment, two people on the precipice of an enormous change, neither quite sure what to do next. Then from inside the hall, the music started again, a slow waltz this time. "Another dance," Jonas offered, and this time there was something almost approaching warmth in his voice. "Another dance," Abigail agreed. They returned to the hall, and this time when they took the floor, the whispers were louder, more pointed. Abigail saw Regina Blackwell in the corner, her beautiful face twisted with fury. She saw her students' parents, some approving, others shocked. She saw Mrs. Pritchard near the refreshment table, raising a glass in subtle salute. But mostly she was aware of Jonas, the solid presence of him, the careful way he held her as if she were something valuable but not fragile. She thought of his proposition so clinical in its delivery, yet underneath it she now sensed something else. Not love, he'd been honest about that, but need. The kind of bone-deep need for connection that she recognized because she felt it too. As they danced, Jonas leaned down slightly. "There's something else I should tell you," he said quietly. "The house. Sarah decorated it. Her things are still there. I haven't been able to. I'll understand if you want to change things." The vulnerability in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present, made something in Abigail's chest tighten. "We'll figure it out together," she said simply. "Together," Jonas repeated, as if testing the word. "I haven't done together in a long time." "Neither have I," Abigail admitted. "We'll probably be terrible at it at first." "Probably," he agreed, and she could hear what might have been amusement in his voice. The evening wore on, and Abigail found herself introduced and reintroduced as Jonas Cutters intended. The women of the town looked at her with new eyes, some with envy, others with pity, still others with a kind of surprised respect. The men were more straightforward, offering congratulations to Jonas, while eyeing Abigail as if trying to solve a puzzle. It was Marcus Blackwell who approached them near the end of the evening, his handsome face wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was everything Jonas was not: smooth where Jonas was rough, polished where Jonas was raw, charming where Jonas was blunt. "Jonas," he said smoothly, "I heard the most extraordinary news. You and the school teacher." "Miss Walker has agreed to be my wife," Jonas said flatly, his hand moving to the small of Abigail's back in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. "How unexpected," Marcus said, turning his attention to Abigail. "You're a brave woman, Miss Walker, or perhaps just desperate." The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty that for a moment Abigail couldn't speak. Then she felt Jonas tense beside her, ready to respond with his fists if necessary, and she found her voice. "I'm practical, Mr. Blackwell," she said coolly. "I recognize value when I see it, and I know the difference between fool's gold and the real thing." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Clever, but cleverness won't protect you from the realities of being Mrs. Jonas Cutter. Ask anyone who knew poor Sarah how that worked out for her. That's enough, Blackwell, Jonas growled, taking a step forward. But Abigail placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Mr. Blackwell, she said, her teacher's voice carrying the kind of authority that could quiet a room full of unruly children. I understand you're upset about your recent business disappointments, but taking your frustrations out on others is beneath a man of your supposed standing. If you'll excuse us, my fiancé promised me another dance. She turned away, drawing Jonas with her, leaving Marcus standing alone, his face flushed with anger. As they moved onto the dance floor, she could feel Jonas looking down at her with something like surprise. You've got steel in you, he said quietly. I teach 12-year-old boys, Abigail replied. Marcus Blackwell doesn't scare me. For the first time since she'd met him, Jonas Cutter almost smiled. It was just a slight upturn of his lips, a softening around his eyes, but it transformed his face entirely. For just a moment, Abigail could see the man he might have been before loss carved those lines into his face, before duty and grief turned him to stone. The last dance of the evening was announced, and Jonas held her closer than strictly proper as they moved together. Around them, Red Fern Ridge society watched and whispered and wondered. But in that moment, Abigail found she didn't care. She'd made her choice, practical, calculated, perhaps even cold, but hers nonetheless. As the music ended and Jonas escorted her toward the door, she caught a glimpse of them in the mirror that hung near the entrance. They looked mismatched. He too large, too rough. She too plain, too rigid. But there was something in the way they stood together, something in the space between them that wasn't quite touching but wasn't quite separate either. I'll call on you tomorrow, Jonas said as he helped her with her shawl. We have arrangements to discuss. Tomorrow's Sunday, Abigail reminded him. I'll be at church. Then I'll be at church too, he said simply. We might as well give them a proper show. Outside, the night had grown cold and their breath formed clouds in the air. Jonas walked her back to the boarding house, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. At the door, he paused. Abigail, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name. I want you to know. He said, I'll try to be a good husband. I can't promise love, but I can promise respect, protection, and fidelity. I'll never raise a hand to you, never deliberately hurt you, never make you regret this choice, if I can help it. The moonlight caught his face, highlighting the sincerity there, the careful hope of a man who'd learned not to expect much from life, but was willing to try once more. I believe you, Abigail said softly. And she did. Whatever else Jonas Cutter was, he was a man of his word. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away into the darkness. Abigail stood at the door for a long moment, watching his silhouette disappear, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger and the weight of the choice she'd made. Inside, Mrs. Pritchard was waiting in the parlor, ostensibly knitting but clearly anticipating Abigail's return. Well, the older woman asked, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Abigail held up her left hand, the small diamond catching the lamplight. Mrs. Pritchard set down her knitting and stood moving to embrace Abigail with surprising warmth. Oh, child, she said softly. You've chosen a hard road, but maybe a good one. Maybe, Abigail agreed, returning the embrace. It was the first time anyone had held her in longer than she could remember. That night, in her narrow bed in her tiny room, Abigail lay awake, staring at the ceiling. In 3 weeks, she would be Mrs. Jonas Cutter. She would leave this small space that had been her refuge and her prison for 6 years. She would become mistress of a ranch house she'd only seen from a distance. She would share her life with a man who promised everything except love. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten its name: anticipation. Her life, static for so many years, was about to change dramatically. The safe, predictable routine of her spinsterhood was ending, and something unknown was beginning. She turned the ring on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Jonas had been right about one thing: they were both wasting their lives on isolation. Perhaps together they could build something better than what either could manage alone. Not a love story maybe, but something real and solid and true. Tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, the gossip of the entire town. But tonight, Abigail Walker, soon to be Abigail Cutter, allowed herself to imagine a future that contained more than chalk dust and empty evenings. A future with purpose beyond the classroom. A future where loneliness might finally loosen its grip on her heart. The wind rattled her window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. But for the first time in 6 years, the sound didn't make her feel alone. Somewhere out there in a ranch house on the prairie, Jonas Cutter was probably lying awake too, contemplating the same uncertain future. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, their real story would begin. The 3 weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparations and barely concealed scandal. That first Sunday morning after the dance, Abigail arrived at church to find every pew buzzing with whispered conversations that ceased the moment she entered. She kept her chin high, her left hand visible, the modest diamond catching the morning light streaming through the windows as she made her way to her usual seat. Jonas arrived 10 minutes later, and the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath as he walked directly to her pew and sat beside her. The space between them was careful, proper, but his presence beside her felt like a declaration of war against the town's expectations. Reverend Thompson nearly dropped his hymnal when he saw them together, and his sermon on the sanctity of marriage took on a particularly pointed tone that made several parishioners shift uncomfortably. After the service, as they stood on the church steps, Jonas's hand at her elbow was light but unmistakably proprietary. The receiving line moved slowly, each person offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to barely civil. It was Mrs. Hartley, Emma's mother, who broke through the awkwardness with genuine warmth. "Miss Walker," she said, taking Abigail's hands in both of hers. "I'm so pleased for you. The Cutter Ranch needs a woman's touch again, and those boys Jonas employs need someone to civilize them at dinner." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley," Abigail replied, grateful for the kindness. "Your Emma mentioned you knew Sarah." Something flickered in the older woman's eyes. "I did. She was a dear soul, but fragile." "You're different, Miss Walker. You're what Jonas needs now." She lowered her voice, glancing at where Jonas was speaking with Tom Bradley. "Don't let anyone tell you different. That man grieved something terrible, but he's ready to live again. I can see it in how he looks at you." Before Abigail could ask what she meant, Mrs. Hartley was moving on, and Regina Blackwell was approaching with her husband in tow. Marcus's face was a mask of polite indifference, but Regina's smile was sharp as glass. "Miss Walker," she cooed, "how thrilling this must be for you. From the schoolhouse to the finest ranch in the county, every spinster's dream come true." "Every woman hopes for security and respect in marriage," Abigail replied evenly. "I'm fortunate to have found both." "Security, certainly," Regina agreed, her eyes glittering, "but respect, well, time will tell." "Won't it? Jonas does have such particular ways. Poor Sarah found them quite challenging." Jonas appeared at Abigail's side, then his timing deliberate. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said coolly, "I trust you'll be too busy with your own household to concern yourself with mine." "Of course," Regina replied, but her smile remained predatory. "We're all just so fascinated by this unexpected match. The schoolteacher and the rancher. It's like something out of a dime novel." "Reality is rarely as dramatic as fiction," Abigail interjected. "We're simply two practical people making a practical arrangement." "How refreshingly honest." Marcus finally spoke, his tone suggesting anything but admiration. "Most couples pretend at romance, at least initially." "Pretense is exhausting," Jonas said flatly, "and ultimately pointless. If you'll excuse us, we have appointments to keep." As they walked away, Abigail could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following them. Jonas guided her toward his carriage, a well-appointed vehicle that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. "You handled that well," he said as he helped her up. "I've dealt with difficult parents for years," Abigail replied. "The Blackwells are just older versions of playground bullies." Jonas took the reins, and they drove in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I thought you should see the house. Your house soon enough. Mrs. Chen, my housekeeper, is expecting us for lunch." The road to the Cutter Ranch wound through prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Abigail had seen the property from a distance, but had never approached it directly. As they crested a small rise, the house came into view, and her breath caught involuntarily. It was larger than she'd imagined, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that spoke of summer evenings and peaceful mornings. The windows were numerous and large, flooding the interior with light. Gardens, now dormant with autumn's approach, flanked the front path, and she could see the remains of what must have been Sarah's roses. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Sarah loved it," Jonas replied, and there was something careful in his tone. "She spent 2 years getting it exactly right. I haven't changed anything since—" He didn't finish, but Abigail understood. The house was a monument to his first wife, preserved like a museum. She wondered if she would be living in Sarah's shadow or if she'd be allowed to make her own mark. Mrs. Chen met them at the door, a small, neat woman with silver threading through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She studied Abigail with frank assessment before offering a small smile. "Miss Walker," she said, her English accented but clear, "welcome. Mr. Jonas told me to prepare lunch. You have dietary restrictions." "None," Abigail replied, charmed by the woman's directness. "And please call me Abigail." Mrs. Chen's smile widened slightly. "I call you Miss Abigail. Mr. Jonas says you stay teacher until wedding, after you Mrs. Cutter." The tour that followed was surreal. Jonas led her through rooms that were beautifully appointed but felt frozen in time. Sarah's watercolors still hung on the walls. Her embroidery still decorated the cushions. Her books still lined the shelves in the parlor. It was like walking through a beautiful tomb. The room that would be Abigail's was at the end of the upstairs hallway, separated from the master bedroom by 2 other rooms. It was spacious and bright with windows facing east toward the sunrise. The furniture was simple but well made, and Abigail noticed with relief that it bore no obvious marks of Sarah's presence. "This was meant to be a nursery," Jonas said from the doorway, not entering the room. We never needed it for that purpose. Mrs. Chen has prepared it for you, but you can change anything you like." "It's perfect," Abigail said, running her hand along the smooth wood of the dresser. "The light is beautiful." "There's a small room adjoining that could be a study," Jonas continued. "For your books, your teaching preparations. I know you'll want to continue until—" The unfinished sentence hung between them. "Until children came. Until their practical arrangement produced its most practical result." Lunch was a quiet affair, the 3 of them eating Mrs. Chen's excellent beef stew while discussing household matters. Jonas explained the ranch routine, the rhythm of life dictated by cattle and seasons. Mrs. Chen outlined her duties and made it clear she expected Abigail to take over menu planning and household management after the wedding. "Mrs. Sarah, she not interested in kitchen?" Mrs. Chen said with diplomatic neutrality. "She like gardens, painting, music. You?" "I'm interested in everything that makes a household run smoothly," Abigail replied. "I've been managing my own affairs for years, but I'd be grateful for your guidance with a house this size." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "You practical. Good. Ranch house needs practical woman." After lunch, Jonas took her to see the rest of the property. The barn was enormous, housing dozens of horses and the equipment needed for a working ranch. The bunkhouse where the unmarried ranch hands lived was set at a respectful distance from the main house. There was a smokehouse, a root cellar, and even a small schoolhouse that Sarah had built with the intention of teaching the workers' children. "It was never used," Jonas explained as they stood in the dusty space. "Sarah fell ill before she could start teaching, but it's well built if you wanted to continue working with children here instead of in town." Abigail turned slowly, taking in the neat rows of desks, the pristine blackboard, the unopened boxes of supplies. Another monument to unfulfilled dreams. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "once I understand what my duties at the house require." The ride back to town was conducted mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that didn't demand filling. As they neared the boarding house, Jonas finally spoke. "I've arranged for Mrs. Patterson to make your wedding dress. She has your measurements from the church auxiliary, and she'll come by tomorrow for a fitting." Abigail looked at him in surprise. "That's very thoughtful." "Practical," he corrected, but there was something in his expression that suggested otherwise. "A rancher's wife needs to look the part. I've also opened an account for you at the mercantile. Get whatever you need." "Jonas, I have my own money." "Which you've been sending to that orphanage in St. Louis," he interrupted. "Continue doing so if you wish, but your personal needs are my responsibility now." The statement should have rankled, should have felt like a loss of independence. Instead, Abigail found herself oddly moved by the matter-of-fact way he'd assumed the role of provider. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Patterson. The town's best seamstress proved to be a romantic at heart, creating a wedding dress of ivory silk that managed to be both elegant and practical. The bodice was fitted but not restrictive, the skirt full but not cumbersome. When Abigail first tried it on, she barely recognized herself. "You look like a bride," Mrs. Pritchard said, tears in her eyes. "A real bride." "I am a real bride," Abigail replied, though she understood what the older woman meant. She looked like someone who was marrying for love, not logic. Her students were torn between excitement and dismay at the news. Emma Hartley cried when Abigail announced she would be leaving at the end of the week, while Tommy Morrison declared that Mr. Cutter was lucky to get the only teacher who could make arithmetic interesting. It was young Jake Morrison who asked the question everyone was thinking. "Do you love him, Miss Walker?" Abigail looked at the expectant faces of her students. These children she'd poured her heart into for 6 years and chose honesty tempered with kindness. "There are many kinds of love, Jake," she said carefully. "The love in stories and songs is just one type. There's also the love that grows from respect, from partnership, from building something together. Mr. Cutter and I are starting with respect. The rest, we'll see what grows." The town council hired her replacement with unusual speed, a young man fresh from teachers' college who seemed terrified of the children and even more terrified of Abigail. She spent her remaining days training him, trying to convey 6 years of experience in a handful of afternoons. Jonas came by the schoolhouse each evening to drive her home, a gesture that set tongues wagging, but which Abigail found unexpectedly pleasant. They would talk about ranch business, about the children, about anything except the approaching wedding that loomed ever larger. 3 days before the ceremony, Marcus Blackwell made his move. Abigail was alone in the schoolhouse packing up her personal belongings when he entered without knocking. "Miss Walker," he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "We need to talk." Abigail straightened her hand, moving instinctively toward the heavy paperweight on her desk. "Mr. Blackwell, this is inappropriate. Please leave." "In 3 days you'll be beyond my reach," Marcus said, moving closer. "So I'll say this now. Jonas Cutter is using you. He needs a wife to secure a business deal with Eastern investors who prefer family men. He needs someone respectable to offset the rumors about Sarah's death. And he needs you as a shield against me." "Your point?" Abigail asked coldly. "My point is that you could do better. I could offer you things Jonas never will. Passion, adventure, genuine affection." He moved closer still, and Abigail could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. "Call off the wedding. Come work for me instead. I need someone to help manage my business correspondence. The pay would be generous, and there would be no expectations." "Except the expectation that I betray my fiancé," Abigail said. "A fiancé who doesn't love you," Marcus countered, "who will never love you, who is incapable of loving anyone after Sarah." "And you claim to offer better," Abigail laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You who've been trying to steal Jonas's land, who've spread rumors about both of us, who even now is attempting to seduce an engaged woman out of spite." Marcus's handsome face darkened. "You're making a mistake. Jonas Cutter is a hard man, and hard men break the women around them. Ask anyone who knew Sarah in her final months. Ask them about the bruises, the tears, the begging to go home." The door crashed open, and Jonas filled the doorway like an avenging angel. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with cold fire. "Blackwell," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "If you ever come near my fiancée again, if you ever speak her name, if you so much as look in her direction, I will destroy you. Not your business, not your reputation, you. Do you understand?" Marcus straightened his jacket, attempting nonchalance. "Threats, Jonas. How unlike you." "Not a threat," Jonas replied. "A promise. And if you continue spreading lies about Sarah, I'll have you in court for slander. I have witnesses, Blackwell. People who were there when she died, who know exactly what kind of husband I was. Your stories might entertain barroom gossips, but they won't hold up before a judge." Marcus looked between them, his expression calculating. Then he smiled, cold and sharp. "We'll see, Cutter. We'll see." After he left, Jonas stood rigid in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists. Abigail moved toward him carefully as one might approach a wounded animal. "Jonas?" she said softly. He looked at her then, and she saw something raw in his expression. "Did he touch you?" "No." He was all talk and cologne. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You're not afraid of anything, are you?" "I'm afraid of many things," Abigail admitted, "but Marcus Blackwell isn't one of them." Jonas moved into the room, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller. "What he said about Sarah—" "I don't believe him," Abigail interrupted. "Mrs. Hartley told me the truth. Sarah was ill probably for longer than anyone realized. The fever just finished what had already begun." Jonas sank into one of the small student chairs, which creaked ominously under his weight. He looked absurd there, this giant of a man in a child's seat, and somehow that made him seem more human than he'd ever appeared before. "She was homesick," he said quietly. That much was true. She missed Boston, missed her family, missed the life she'd imagined we'd have. I promised her civilization, and I gave her prairie grass and cattle drives. She never complained, not directly, but I could see her fading like a flower without water. Abigail sat on the edge of her desk, close enough to touch him, but maintaining careful distance. "You can't blame yourself for that." "Can I?" Jonas looked up at her. "I knew she wasn't suited for this life, but I wanted her anyway. I thought love would be enough. I thought I could be enough. And now I know better. That's why I chose you, Abigail. Not because you're second best or convenient, but because you're strong where Sarah was fragile. You see this life as it is, not as you wish it were." The honesty of it should have hurt, but instead Abigail found it oddly comforting. She was chosen not despite her practicality, but because of it. "In 2 days we'll be married," she said quietly. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Jonas stood, and suddenly he was very close, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "I'm certain that we can build something real together, something lasting. Not a fairy tale, but something better, a partnership based on truth." He raised his hand as if to touch her face, then seemed to think better of it, letting it fall. "I should go. It's not proper for us to be alone here." "Since when have we cared about proper?" Abigail asked with a small smile. "Since I promised to protect your reputation," Jonas replied seriously. "I mean to be a good husband, Abigail. That starts with being a proper fiancé." The wedding day dawned clear and cold with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the whole world seem sharper, more defined. Abigail stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house, barely recognizing the woman reflected there. The ivory dress fit perfectly, and Mrs. Pritchard had helped pin her hair into an elegant arrangement with small white asters from the late-blooming garden. "You're beautiful," Mrs. Pritchard said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I know you don't believe it, but you are." The church was fuller than Abigail had expected. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the marriage of the spinster schoolteacher and the widowed rancher. She stood at the back door, her bouquet of prairie roses and sage trembling slightly in her hands, listening to the murmur of voices inside. Then the music started, and there was no more time for doubt. The walk down the aisle felt both endless and instant. She was aware of faces turning toward her, some smiling, some skeptical, some merely curious. But at the altar, Jonas waited, and the look on his face when he saw her made everything else fade away. It wasn't love, not the kind poets wrote about, but it was something, appreciation perhaps, or recognition. He looked at her like a man seeing dawn after a very long night. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, though his voice caught slightly when he asked if anyone objected. The pause stretched longer than usual, and Abigail was acutely aware of Marcus Blackwell, in the third row, his jaw clenched but silent. When Jonas slipped the ring onto her finger, a different ring from the engagement band. This one, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. His hands were steady, warm, certain. When he promised to love, honor, and cherish, his voice carried the weight of a man who understood the gravity of vows. And when Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, telling Jonas, He could kiss his bride time seemed to slow. Jonas lifted her veil with careful hands, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had chosen practicality over passion, partnership over romance. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was meant to be a brief ceremonial touch, but the moment his lips met hers, something electric passed between them. Abigail's hand came up instinctively to rest against his chest, and she felt his sharp intake of breath. The kiss deepened for just a moment, just long enough for her to taste coffee and mint, to feel the surprising softness of his lips, to sense the carefully controlled strength in the way he held her. When they parted, both were breathing a bit unsteadily. The congregation erupted in applause, but Abigail barely heard it. She was too focused on the look in Jonas's eyes, surprised, almost vulnerable, as if he too had felt that unexpected spark. The reception was held at the Grange Hall, transformed once again with lanterns and autumn flowers. Abigail moved through it in a daze, accepting congratulations, dancing with Jonas, and then with what seemed like every man in town eating cake she couldn't taste drinking punch. That might as well have been water. It was during a brief respite, when Jonas was cornered by business associates and Abigail had stepped onto the terrace for air, that Sarah's sister appeared. Abigail recognized her immediately from the portrait in Jonas's study, the same delicate features, the same golden hair, though Elizabeth Bennet's face bore lines of experience that Sarah had never lived to acquire. "Mrs. Cutter," Elizabeth said, and there was something testing in the way she used the title. "I wanted to meet the woman who finally thawed Jonas's frozen heart." "I don't think his heart was frozen," Abigail replied carefully. "Wounded, perhaps. Guarded, but not frozen." Elizabeth studied her with sharp blue eyes. "You're not what I expected. When I heard Jonas was remarrying, I assumed he'd chosen someone like Sarah. Beautiful, delicate, needing protection." "I'm none of those things." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "You're something better. You're what he needs now." She paused, glancing through the windows to where Jonas stood. "Sarah was my baby sister, and I loved her dearly. But she was wrong for this life, wrong for Jonas, though neither of them could see it until too late. She needed the city society culture. He needed someone who could stand beside him, not behind him." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because there will be days when you'll wonder if you're living in her shadow, when you'll find her ghost in every corner of that house." Elizabeth's voice softened. "But you should know that Sarah herself would have chosen you for him. In her final days, she told me she wished Jonas could find someone strong enough to truly partner with him, someone who could see past his walls to the good man beneath. I think she would have liked you, Mrs. Cutter." Before Abigail could respond, Elizabeth was gone, disappearing into the crowd like a blessing bestowed and withdrawn. Jonas appeared moments later, his face concerned. "Are you well?" he asked. "You look pale." "Your sister-in-law was here, Sarah's sister." Jonas tensed. "What did she want?" "To give us her blessing, I think." Something in Jonas's shoulders relaxed. Elizabeth always was more perceptive than the rest of the Bennett family. They blamed me for taking Sarah west, but Elizabeth understood that Sarah chose this life even if it didn't choose her back. The evening was winding down, the older couples departing, the younger ones growing rowdier with each passing hour. Jonas touched her elbow gently. "We should go," he said quietly. "Mrs. S. Chen will have prepared supper, and you must be exhausted." The ride to the ranch was conducted in silence, but it was charged with new awareness. Abigail was acutely conscious of Jonas beside her, of the ring on her finger, of the way the moonlight caught his profile. This was her husband now, this complicated, wounded, strong man who had chosen her for exactly who she was. The house was lit warmly when they arrived, Mrs. Chen having prepared everything before discreetly retiring to her quarters. There was food laid out in the dining room, wine breathing on the sideboard, fires crackling in the main rooms. "Are you hungry?" Jonas asked, seeming suddenly uncertain in his own home. "Not particularly," Abigail admitted. The cake and punch sat heavy in her stomach along with the weight of the day's emotions. They stood in the entrance hall, neither quite sure what came next. This was where a traditional wedding night would proceed to the marriage bed, but they had agreed to separate rooms, separate lives, until they both decided otherwise. "I'll show you to your room," Jonas said finally. "You'll want to get out of that dress." He led her upstairs carrying her small valise. The rest of her belongings would be delivered tomorrow. At her door he paused. Abigail, he said, then stopped seeming to struggle with words. Today was not what I expected. What did you expect? A business arrangement, a contract signed and witnessed. He met her eyes. But when I saw you in that church, when I kissed you, he shook his head. I don't know what this is between us, but it's not simple. No, Abigail agreed softly. It's not simple. They stood there, two people on the threshold of a new life, neither quite brave enough to step forward, neither quite willing to step back. Finally, Jonas raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Mrs. Cutter. Good night, Mr. Cutter. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. Through the wood, she could hear his footsteps moving down the hall, the sound of his own door opening and closing. She was married now, but sleeping alone. Bound but separate. Connected, but apart. She moved to the window and looked out at the prairie spreading endlessly under the stars. Somewhere out there, coyotes hunted and wind sang through grass, and life continued its ancient dance. And here in this house, that echoed with another woman's ghost, Abigail began her new life as Mrs. Jonas Cutter. She changed out of her wedding dress, carefully hanging it in the wardrobe that smelled of cedar and lavender. The nightgown Mrs. Pritchard had insisted she buy seemed too fine for sleeping alone, but she put it on anyway, a silk acknowledgement of her new status. The bed was large and comfortable, the sheets crisp and clean, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound in the house seemed magnified, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the windows, and from down the hall the faint sound of Jonas moving in his own room. Was he also lying awake wondering what they'd done? Was he thinking of Sarah in this same house, in that same room? Or was he thinking of that kiss at the altar, that moment when their practical arrangement had suddenly felt like something more? A soft knock at the door made her sit up, heart pounding. Abigail. Jonas's voice was quiet. Are you awake? Yes, she called back, pulling a shawl around her shoulders before opening the door. He stood in the hallway, still in his wedding clothes, minus the jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. In his hands, he held a steaming mug. Mrs. Chen left this, he said, offering her the cup. It's her special tea. She says it helps with sleep on important nights. Abigail took the mug, inhaling the fragrant steamed chamomile and something else. Something sweet and spicy. That's kind of her. She approves of you, Jonas said. That's no small thing. She barely tolerated Sarah, though she'd never say so. Why? Jonas leaned against the doorframe, and for a moment he looked younger, less guarded. Sarah was afraid of her, called her that Chinese woman, and wanted me to hire someone Irish or German. Mrs. Chen knew it, but she stayed because she'd promised my mother she'd look after me. Your mother knew Mrs. Chen. They met in San Francisco years ago. My mother was there with my father for business, and Mrs. Chen was, well, that's her story to tell. But when my parents were killed in that carriage accident 5 years ago, Mrs. Chen came here, said she had a debt to repay. Abigail sipped the tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. You collect loyal people. Do I? Jonas seemed genuinely surprised. I've never thought of it that way. Your ranch hands speak well of you. Mrs. Chen traveled hundreds of miles to keep a promise to your mother. Even Elizabeth, who could have hated you, came to give us her blessing. And you? Jonas asked quietly. Why did you say yes? Abigail considered the question, standing there in her doorway in her nightgown, drinking tea with her new husband, who was still essentially a stranger. Because you saw me, she said finally. Not the spinster schoolteacher everyone pitied, not the aging woman everyone overlooked, but me. You saw that I visited the cemetery. You knew about the orphanage. You noticed things no one else bothered to see. I'm good at watching, Jonas admitted. It's safer than participating. But you participated today, Abigail pointed out. That kiss wasn't watching. Even in the dim hallway light, she could see color rise in his cheeks. No, he agreed. That was unexpected. They stood there, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Jonas straightened, stepping back. I should let you rest. Tomorrow will be busy. The hands will want to meet you properly, and there's the household management to review with Mrs. Chen. Jonas? Abigail called as he turned to go. Thank you for the tea, for today, for choosing me. He looked back at her, and for just a moment his expression was completely unguarded. Thank you for saying yes. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall. Abigail closed her door and returned to bed, the tea working its magic, pulling her toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was of that kiss at the altar, of the surprise in Jonas's eyes that had matched her own. Perhaps their practical arrangement wasn't so practical after all. The first weeks of marriage unfolded with the careful choreography of two people learning to share space while maintaining distance. Abigail woke each morning to the sound of Jonas's boots on the stairs, always before dawn, always purposeful. She would lie in her bed listening to the rhythm of his morning routine, the pump handle squeaking as he washed, the low murmur of his voice giving orders to the ranch hands, the creak of saddle leather as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she descended for breakfast, he would be gone, leaving only the lingering scent of coffee and leather. Mrs. Chen would serve her eggs and toast with knowing looks, but no comments, and Abigail would spend her mornings learning the intricate management of a household far larger than anything she'd previously imagined. The ledgers alone told a story of complexity she hadn't anticipated. Feed orders, supply shipments, wages for 23 regular hands, plus seasonal workers, contracts with buyers from Chicago and Denver, correspondence with investors back east. Sarah, it seemed, had ignored all of this, leaving Jonas to manage both the ranch and the household accounts. Mrs. Sarah, she say numbers make her head hurt, Mrs. Chen explained one afternoon as they reviewed the pantry inventory. She liked pretty things, not practical things. And Jonas accepted that, Abigail asked, marking down the need for more flour and sugar. Mrs. Chen's expression grew careful. Mr. Jonas, he accept many things. Too many, maybe. He think love means never asking for change. It was 3 weeks into their marriage when the first sign of trouble appeared. Abigail was in the study reconciling the household accounts when she heard horses approaching at speed. Through the window, she saw Jonas riding hard toward the house, his foreman Pete Rodriguez beside him. Both men's faces grim. Jonas burst through the front door, calling her name with an urgency that made her stomach clench. She found him in the entrance hall, dust-covered and tense. What's wrong? She asked. Blackwell's made his move, Jonas said tersely. He's claiming the North Pasture says he has a deed from before my father bought the land. He's got a judge in Denver backing him up and men stationed at the creek. Armed men. Jonas's jaw tightened. Armed men. Pete Rodriguez, a compact man with intelligent dark eyes, added, They've already cut our fence lines, Mrs. Cutter, moved about 50 head of Blackwell cattle onto the land. Abigail's mind raced. The original deed, where is it? In my father's papers somewhere, Jonas said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Sarah was supposed to organize them years ago, but where are the papers now? Abigail interrupted, already moving toward the study. Boxes in the attic, dozens of them. Then we'd better start looking, Abigail said firmly. Pete, can you send someone to town for Tom Bradley at the bank? He witnessed your father's purchase. And send another man for Judge Thornton. He's circuit riding, but should be in Millbrook today. Both men stared at her. How do you know where Judge Thornton is? Jonas asked. Because I actually read the newspaper, Abigail replied dryly. And I've been teaching his nephew for 3 years. Now go, we're wasting time. The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. While Jonas and Pete organized the ranch hands for potential conflict, Abigail attacked the boxes in the attic with systematic determination. Mrs. Chen brought up lamp after lamp as the afternoon faded to evening, and together they sorted through 20 years of ranch documentation. It was near midnight when Abigail found it, not the deed itself, but something better. A surveyor's report from 1863, signed and witnessed, showing that the creek Blackwell claimed as his boundary actually ran a quarter-mile west of where it currently flowed. The creek changed course, she breathed, staring at the map. Jonas. He appeared in the attic doorway moments later, having heard her call from the study below. She showed him the document, explaining rapidly. The flood of 71, Jonas said, understanding immediately. It shifted the creek bed. Blackwell's claiming land based on where the water runs now, not where the legal boundary was set. Tom Bradley should have records of the flood damage claims, Abigail added, and Judge Thornton will have to honor a witness survey report. Jonas stared at her with something like wonder. You may have just saved the ranch. We haven't saved anything yet, Abigail replied, but she felt a flush of satisfaction at the approval in his eyes. Judge Thornton arrived the next morning, a stern man with piercing eyes who listened to both sides with judicial impartiality. Blackwell, dressed in his finest suit, presented his case with smooth confidence, producing a deed that looked authentic enough. Then Abigail presented the surveyor's report. Your Honor, she said, her teacher's voice carrying clearly across the crowded main room of the ranch house. This certified survey predates Mr. Blackwell's deed by 15 years. It clearly shows the legal boundary of the Cutter Ranch extending well past the current creek position. Rivers change course all the time, Blackwell argued. Natural boundaries supersede paper ones. Not in legal terms, Judge Thornton said, slowly examining the documents. Mrs. Cutter is correct. The boundary was set by survey, not by natural feature. The fact that the creek moved doesn't change the property lines. Blackwell's face darkened. This is ridiculous. Everyone knows that creek has always been the boundary. Everyone knows what they assume, Abigail interjected. But assumptions aren't law, Mr. Blackwell. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The north pasture remained Cutter land. Blackwell was ordered to remove his cattle immediately and pay damages for the cut fences. But as he stormed from the house, he paused beside Abigail. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice venomous. You think you're clever, but you're just a schoolteacher playing at being a rancher's wife. When reality hits, you'll crumble like Sarah did. The difference between Sarah and me, Abigail replied evenly, is that I don't crumble. I'm from harder stock than you imagine, Mr. Blackwell. That night, Jonas found her on the porch wrapped in a shawl against the cool evening air. He sat beside her on the bench, maintaining careful distance as always. You were magnificent today, he said quietly. I've never seen Blackwell so thoroughly outmaneuvered. He'll try again, Abigail warned. Men like him don't accept defeat easily. Let him try. With you managing the papers and me managing the ranch, we make a formidable team. The word we hung between them, weighted with new meaning. In the weeks since their wedding, they'd developed a careful routine of parallel lives intersecting at meals and household business, but maintaining their agreed-upon distance. But today had been different. Today, they'd worked together truly together for the first time. Jonas, Abigail began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. This partnership is becoming something more than we planned. Before she could respond, a shout from the bunkhouse shattered the moment. Smoke was rising from the barn, orange flames licking at the hayloft. Fire! Someone screamed, and suddenly the night erupted into chaos. Jonas was running before the word fully registered Abigail close behind. Ranch hands appeared from everywhere, forming bucket brigades, fighting desperately to save the structure, and more importantly, the horses trapped inside. The wind's pushing it toward the house, Pete shouted over the roar of flames. Jonas didn't hesitate. He plunged into the burning barn, emerging moments later, leading 2 terrified horses. Again and again, he went back until Abigail grabbed his arm. You'll die if you go in again, she said fiercely. There are still 3 horses. Then we go together, she said, already moving. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke choking, but together they managed to free the last of the horses, stumbling out just as part of the roof collapsed. Jonas pulled her against him, both of them coughing, covered in soot and ash. You could have been killed, he said roughly, his hands gripping her shoulders. So could you, she replied, looking up at him through the smoke and chaos. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the 2 of them standing there in the hellish glow of the fire, breathing hard, very much alive. Then Jonas seemed to remember himself, releasing her and turning back to fight the flames. It took 3 hours to bring the fire under control. The barn was a total loss, but they'd saved the horses and kept the flames from spreading to the house, or bunkhouse. As dawn broke gray and smoky, the exhausted ranch hands gathered in the courtyard. This wasn't an accident, Pete said grimly, holding up a charred kerosene can. Someone set this deliberately. All eyes turned to where Blackwell's ranch lay beyond the horizon, but Jonas shook his head. We can't prove anything, and Blackwell's too smart to leave evidence. So he just gets away with it, one of the younger hands demanded angrily.
No, Abigail said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. We rebuild. Stronger, better, and we watch more carefully. Mr. Blackwell wants us to retaliate to give him an excuse to escalate. We won't give him that satisfaction. Jonas looked at her covered in soot. Her dress ruined her hair, hanging loose around her shoulders, and something shifted in his expression. You heard Mrs. Cutter hit, he told the men. We rebuild, starting today. The next weeks were a blur of construction and vigilance. Jonas hired extra guardsmen who patrolled the property boundaries day and night. Abigail organized the rebuilding effort with military precision, negotiating with suppliers, managing schedules, keeping the ranch running smoothly despite the chaos. It was during this time that she truly became mistress of the house. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the schoolteacher bride, now tipped their hats with genuine respect.
Mrs. Chen began deferring to her judgment entirely, and even Jonas seemed to see her differently. One evening, as they reviewed building plans in the study, Abigail became aware of Jonas watching her instead of the blueprints. What? She asked, self-conscious. You've changed, he said simply. Or maybe I'm just seeing you clearly for the first time. I'm the same person who said yes to your proposition, Abigail replied. No, Jonas disagreed. That woman was hiding her strength, making herself smaller to fit into the space the world allowed her. This woman, he gestured to her, to the papers spread across the desk, to the entire room that now bore subtle marks of her presence. This woman is who you really are. Before Abigail could respond, Mrs. Chen knocked urgently. Mr. Jonas Ryder's coming, many riders. They rushed to the porch to see a dozen men approaching Blackwell at their head. But these weren't ranch hands, they wore badges, and their leader was a U.S. Marshal. Jonas Cutter. The Marshal called out, I have a warrant for your arrest. On what charge? Jonas demanded, though Abigail could see his body tensing for fight or flight. Murder, Blackwell said with vicious satisfaction. The murder of your first wife, Sarah Cutter. The words hit like physical blows. Abigail heard Mrs. Chen's sharp intake of breath, saw the shock on the ranch hands' faces as they gathered. That's absurd, Abigail said, stepping forward. Sarah died of fever. There are witnesses. New evidence has come to light, the Marshal interrupted. A witness who claims to have seen Mr. Cutter administering poison in the days before his wife's death. What witness? Jonas asked, his voice deadly calm. Blackwell's smile was triumphant. Regina remembered something important. How you sent all the servants away the week Sarah died. How you alone tended to her. How you refused to let the doctor see her until it was too late. Because she asked me to, Jonas said through gritted teeth. She was delirious with fever, frightened of strangers. I was trying to comfort her. Tell it to the judge, the Marshal said, not unkindly. Mr. Cutter, I need you to come peacefully. Abigail's mind raced. This was Blackwell's ultimate play. With Jonas imprisoned awaiting trial, the ranch would be vulnerable. She'd be alone, unprotected, fighting both legal battles and whoever Blackwell sent to intimidate her. I'm coming with him, she announced. Abigail, no? Jonas began. I'm your wife, she said firmly. Where you go, I go. She turned to Pete. You're in charge of the ranch. Mrs. Chen packed bags for both of us. We'll be staying in town until this farce is resolved. The Marshal looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, he's going to jail. Then I'll take a room at the boarding house and visit every day, Abigail replied. But I won't leave my husband to face these lies alone. Something flickered in Jonas's eyes. Surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made Abigail's heart skip. The ride to town was tense, Blackwell riding alongside them with barely concealed glee. But his satisfaction dimmed when they arrived to find not just the sheriff waiting, but Judge Thornton Tom Bradley, and surprisingly, Elizabeth Bennett. What's the meaning of this? Blackwell demanded. The meaning, Elizabeth said coolly, is that I've come to testify about my sister's death, and I've brought her diary. The courtroom drama that followed was swift and decisive. Elizabeth presented Sarah's diary filled with her own hand describing her illness, her fear, Jonas's tender care.
Mrs. Hartley testified about the fever that had swept through the county that year, taking 6 lives. Even the doctor summoned from retirement confirmed that Sarah's symptoms were consistent with the fever, not poison. But it was Regina Blackwell's cross-examination that sealed the matter. Under pressure, she admitted she hadn't actually seen Jonas administer anything, she'd simply interpreted certain actions. When pressed further, she broke down and admitted Marcus had promised her a new necklace if she testified. "This is a waste of the court's time," Judge Thornton declared angrily. "Mr. Cutter, you're free to go. Mr. Blackwell." "Mrs. Blackwell, you're both under arrest for perjury and false accusation." The courthouse erupted. Blackwell lunged at Jonas, who caught his fist easily, holding the smaller man at arm's length. "You've lost, Blackwell," Jonas said quietly. "Accept it with whatever dignity you have left." "This isn't over," Blackwell snarled. "I'll destroy you, Cutter. You and that schoolteacher bitch you married." The crack of Abigail's palm against Blackwell's face echoed through the courthouse. The room fell silent. Everyone staring at the small woman who'd just slapped one of the richest men in the county. "You will not speak of my husband that way," she said, her voice carrying the same authority that had quieted hundreds of unruly students over the years. "And you will address me as Mrs. Cutter, or you won't address me at all." Judge Thornton cleared his throat, fighting a smile. "Mrs. Cutter, while I understand your reaction, I can't condone violence in my courthouse." "My apologies, Your Honor," Abigail said, not looking remotely apologetic. "I was overcome by the moment." Outside the courthouse, Jonas caught her arm gently. "You hit him," he said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "He insulted you," Abigail replied simply. "I couldn't allow that." "You defended me." "You're my husband. Of course I defended you." Jonas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Around them, the town continued its business, but for a moment they might have been alone on the prairie. "Abigail," he said, and there was something raw in his voice. "I need to tell you something." "Tonight," she said softly, aware of the watching eyes. "Tell me tonight when we're home." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd shared before. This was charged with anticipation, with words unspoken, but pressing to be voiced. When they arrived, the ranch hands greeted them with cheers. News of Blackwell's arrest had already spread, and Pete had broken out a bottle of whiskey for celebration. But Jonas waved them off his hand at Abigail's back as he guided her into the house. "Mrs. Chen will take supper in our rooms," he called, and the housekeeper's knowing smile followed them up the stairs. At Abigail's door, Jonas paused. "May I come in?" She opened the door wider in answer. He entered her room for the first time since their wedding night, taking in the small changes she'd made her books on the shelves, her mother's quilt on the chair, the dried wildflowers in a vase by the window. "It looks like you," he said softly. "Warm, welcoming, real." "Jonas," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me say this," he said, moving to the window, his back to her, as if the words would come easier without eye contact. "When I proposed to you, I thought I was dead inside. I thought Sarah's death had killed my capacity to feel anything beyond duty and responsibility. I chose you because you seemed safe, someone who wouldn't expect emotions I couldn't give." He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. "But you've changed everything, Abigail. The way you fought for the ranch, the way you stood by me today, the way you've made this house feel like a home again. I'm not dead inside. I'm terrifyingly alive, and it's because of you." Abigail's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What are you saying, Jonas?" He crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "I'm saying that somewhere between your practical acceptance and that slap you gave Blackwell today, I've fallen completely in love with you." The words hung in the air like a miracle. Abigail reached up to cover his hands with hers, feeling the calluses, the strength, the slight tremor that betrayed his nervousness. "You impossible man," she whispered. "I've been in love with you since you noticed I visit the cemetery." His laugh was rough, almost disbelieving. "That's what did it, my creepy observation skills?" "You saw me," she said simply, "the real me, and you chose me anyway." "Not anyway," Jonas corrected. "Because of who you are. Because you're strong and smart and brave and absolutely magnificent when you're angry."
Jonas, she said, and maybe it was his name or the way she said it, but suddenly his mouth was on hers, and this kiss was nothing like the careful touch at their wedding. This was fire and need and 3 months of careful distance exploding into desperate connection. Her hands tangled in his hair, his arms pulled her against him, and she could taste the coffee he'd drunk at the courthouse, feel the desperation in the way he held her like she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Stay," she whispered against his lips. "Please stay." He pulled back slightly to look at her, his gray eyes dark with desire but also concern. "Are you sure we agreed?" "We agreed to wait until we both decided otherwise." Abigail interrupted. "I'm deciding. Are you?" Instead of answering with words, he kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. This time there was only truth and need, and the promise of a future neither had dared hope for. Outside, the sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The new barn's framework stood silhouetted against the horizon, a symbol of rebuilding, of resilience, of refusing to let destruction have the final word. Much later, as they lay entwined in her bed, Jonas traced lazy patterns on Abigail's bare shoulder. "I have a confession," he said quietly. "Another one," she teased, feeling bold in this new intimacy. "That first day when I came to the schoolhouse, I'd been watching you for longer than 3 months. More like a year." Abigail propped herself up on an elbow to look at him. "A year. Since the Christmas pageant, where you made Tommy Morrison be an angel despite his protests, and he ended up loving it. You had this way of seeing what people needed, not just what they wanted. I knew then that you were special. It just took me 9 more months to work up the courage to do something about it." "You afraid?" Abigail laughed. "You faced down gunmen and fires and Marcus Blackwell, but you were afraid of me." "Terrified," Jonas admitted. "You had this complete life, this sense of purpose. What if you'd said no? What if you'd laughed at my proposition? What if I had? Then I'd have kept watching from a distance, probably for the rest of my life, wondering what could have been." Abigail kissed him softly. "No more watching from a distance. No more distance at all," Jonas promised, pulling her close. "We're in this together now, completely." They fell asleep as the moon rose over the prairie, the house settling around them with comfortable sounds. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen smiled to herself as she prepared tomorrow's breakfast for 2 instead of separately having noticed that Mr. Jonas's boots were not in their usual place by his door. The war with Blackwell wasn't over. He'd make bail, he'd recover, he'd likely try again. But tonight in this house that had seen so much sorrow, love had taken root again. Not the fragile, desperate love that Jonas had shared with Sarah, but something stronger built on truth and tested by fire. The schoolteacher and the rancher, the practical woman and the wounded man had found in each other not what they'd expected, but what they'd needed. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. In the morning, there would be work, always work on a ranch. But tonight they had each other, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The morning light filtered through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the bed, where Abigail woke to find Jonas already watching her, his gray eyes soft with an emotion she was still learning to recognize as love. His hand traced the curve of her shoulder, and she shivered despite the warmth of the quilts. "You're awake," she murmured, pressing closer to his solid warmth. "I've been awake for an hour," he admitted, his voice rough with mourning. "Watching you sleep, trying to convince myself this is real." "It's real," Abigail assured him, capturing his hand and pressing it to her lips. "We're real." A knock at the door interrupted them, Mrs. Chen's deliberate warning knock that gave them time to arrange themselves properly. "Mr. Jonas, Mrs. Abigail," she called through the door. "Mr. Pete says urgent business. Men coming from town." Jonas was out of bed, immediately reaching for his clothes with practiced efficiency. Abigail watched him transform from tender lover to hardened rancher in moments, and felt a flutter of something pride perhaps, or possession. This complicated man was hers now, truly hers. They descended together. Abigail having dressed hastily in a practical day dress, her hair still loose around her shoulders. Pete Rodriguez waited in the study, his face grim. "Blackwell made bail," he said without preamble. $5,000 posted by some business associates from Denver. He's out, and word is he's gathering men, not ranch hands' guns for hire. Jonas's jaw tightened. How many? Maybe 20, maybe more. They're camping on his property just waiting. Waiting for what? Abigail asked, though she suspected she knew. For an excuse? Jonas said flatly. Any provocation that would let him claim self-defense when he comes for us. Then we don't give him one, Abigail said firmly. We go about our business, we stay within the law, and we document everything. That's not enough, Pete argued. Mrs. Cutter, with respect, you don't know men like these. They don't need a real excuse, they'll manufacture one. Then we'll be ready, Jonas said. Double the guards. Nobody rides alone. And send word to Judge Thornton about the hired guns. He won't be able to do anything yet, but I want it on record. The next days passed in tense vigilance. Abigail continued her household duties, but she noticed Jonas never let her out of sight for long. When she went to the garden, he found reasons to work nearby. When she visited the new barn construction, he appeared to check the progress. It should have felt suffocating, but instead she found his protectiveness oddly comforting. It was Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Abigail was in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen planning the week's meals when they heard the school bell ringing. Not the church bells that summoned the town for services or emergencies, but the school bell, the one from the old schoolhouse on the ranch that Sarah had built. Nobody uses that building, Mrs. Chen said, alarmed. Abigail was already moving, grabbing the rifle Jonas had taught her to use from its place by the door. The schoolhouse was visible from the kitchen window, and she could see smoke beginning to curl from its windows. Fire! She shouted, even as she realized this was different from the barn fire. This smoke was white chemical wrong. Jonas appeared from the barn already running. Pete and several hands followed, but as they approached the schoolhouse, armed men emerged from concealment. Blackwell's hired guns forming a semicircle that cut the ranch buildings off from the burning schoolhouse. That's far enough, Cutter, one of them called out. Mr. Blackwell wants to talk. And there he was, Marcus Blackwell, emerging from behind the schoolhouse with Regina beside him. She looked terrible, hollow-eyed and trembling, whether from fear or anger, Abigail couldn't tell. You destroyed my reputation, Blackwell called out, his voice carrying across the yard. You turned this town against me. You took everything. You did that yourself, Jonas replied evenly, with lies and false testimony. Lies? Blackwell laughed bitterly. The only lie was thinking I could beat you fairly. You've always had everything, the biggest ranch, the respect of the town. Even Sarah chose you over me. Abigail felt Jonas stiffen beside her. What are you talking about? You didn't know. Regina's laugh was harsh. Sarah and Marcus were childhood sweethearts. She was supposed to marry him until you came along with your fortune and your promises of adventure. Sarah never mentioned, Jonas began. Because she was kind, Blackwell snarled. Too kind to tell you she settled for you when her parents forbade her to marry a man with no prospects. But I've spent 5 years watching you live the life that should have been mine. So this is what it's really about, Abigail said, stepping forward despite Jonas's attempt to hold her back. Not land or money, but jealousy. Blackwell's eyes fixed on her with naked hatred. You think you're so clever, school teacher, but you're just another convenience for Jonas, just like Sarah was. When he's done with you. The gunshot cut him off. Not from Blackwell's men, but from behind them. Sheriff Watson and a dozen deputies emerged from the rise, having approached while everyone's attention was on the confrontation. Nobody move, the sheriff commanded. Blackwell, you're under arrest. Again. This time for arson conspiracy and hiring armed thugs to threaten law-abiding citizens. The hired guns looked at each other uncertainly. They'd been paid to intimidate, not to fight real law enforcement. One by one, they lowered their weapons. But Blackwell wasn't finished. With a movement so fast Abigail barely saw it, he drew a hidden derringer and aimed it at Jonas. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw Jonas beginning to react, but too late, too slow. Without thinking, Abigail grabbed the school bell that someone had removed from the burning building and left on the ground nearby. She hurled it with all the strength years of writing on blackboards had given her arms. The bell struck Blackwell's hand just as he fired, sending the shot wide.
Jonas's return fire was instant and true, catching Blackwell in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Regina screamed, dropping beside her husband as blood spread across his expensive shirt. "You've killed him." "He's alive," Doc Morrison said, appearing from among the deputies. "Though he might wish otherwise when he's facing attempted murder charges on top of everything else." As the sheriff's men rounded up Blackwell's hired guns, and the doctor tended to Blackwell's wound, Jonas pulled Abigail against him, his hands running over her as if checking for injury. "You threw a bell at him," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and exasperation. "You threw a bell at an armed man." "It was handy," Abigail replied, trying to sound calmer than she felt. Her hands were shaking now, the reality of what had almost happened sinking in. "And I'm quite good at throwing things. Ask any of my former students who tried passing notes." Jonas laughed a rough sound that might have been half sob and kissed her hard right there in front of everyone. When they parted, Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. "I'll need statements from everyone," he said, though his eyes twinkled with approval. "But I think it's pretty clear what happened here. Blackwell's looking at significant prison time. Regina too, most likely." As they watched Blackwell being loaded into a prison wagon, his shoulder bandaged, his face twisted with rage and pain, Jonas said quietly, "It's over." "Is it?" Abigail asked. "What about his business associates, his connections in Denver?" "Without Blackwell directing them, they'll fold," Pete said confidently. "He was the money and the motivation. Plus, after this, no legitimate businessman will touch anything connected to him." The cleanup took the rest of the day. The schoolhouse was a total loss, but it had been empty unused since Sarah's death. As they stood watching the ruins smolder, Jonas said, "We should rebuild it. Make it functional this time." "A real school?" Abigail asked, surprised. "The ranch hands have children. The town school is far for the youngest ones. Would you want to teach again? Part-time, of course, and only if you wanted." Abigail looked at him. This man who kept surprising her with his thoughtfulness. "I'd like that, but not yet. For now I have a ranch to help run and a husband to keep out of trouble." That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, the ranch hands gathered for supper in the main house instead of the bunkhouse. Jonas's invitation, a celebration of their survival and victory. The dining room designed for formal dinners that Sarah had never hosted rang with laughter and conversation in multiple languages. Mrs. Chen outdid herself with the meal: roasted beef, fresh bred vegetables from the garden, and 3 kinds of pie. The men toasted Jonas and Abigail repeatedly, and she noticed how they'd begun calling her Mrs. Boss, with genuine affection rather than mere politeness. It was young Tommy Morrison, working his first season as a hand after finishing school, who asked the question everyone was thinking. "Mr. Cutter, what's going to happen to the Blackwell Ranch?" Jonas looked thoughtful. "It'll be sold to pay his legal debts, most likely. The land will probably be broken up into smaller parcels." "You should buy it," Pete suggested. "Consolidate the range." "I have enough land," Jonas replied, "but I might bid on the water rights. Make sure they go to someone who will use them responsibly." After the men had returned to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Chen had retired, Abigail and Jonas sat alone in the parlor, the first real moment of peace they'd had since morning. Jonas had removed his boots and jacket, and Abigail had unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. They sat close on the sofa, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Tell me about Sarah and Blackwell," Abigail said quietly. "The truth of it." Jonas was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, his breath stirring her hair. "I didn't know they'd been sweethearts, but it makes sense now why she was so unhappy, why Blackwell's always hated me with such personal venom." "Do you think she loved him?" "Maybe once, but she chose me, Abigail. Whatever her reasons, she chose me, and she tried to make it work. We both did. But it wasn't enough." "No," Jonas agreed, "because we were both trying to be people we weren't. She was trying to be a ranch wife when she wanted to be a society hostess. I was trying to be a romantic hero when I'm just a practical rancher." Abigail lifted her head to look at him. "You're more than that." "Maybe. With you, I'm more. Or maybe you just see me more clearly than anyone else ever has." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire die down to embers. Then Jonas shifted, reaching into his pocket. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box. "It arrived from Denver yesterday, but with everything that happened." Inside was a ring not elaborate but beautiful in its simplicity, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds set in gold that gleamed warm in the firelight. "Your mother's ring is precious," Jonas said softly, "but it was chosen for duty. This one is chosen for love. If you'll wear it." Abigail's eyes filled with tears as he slipped it onto her right hand, the left still bearing his mother's ring, the symbol of their practical beginning. "It's beautiful." "The sapphire reminded me of your eyes when you're angry," Jonas said with a slight smile. "Like when you slapped Blackwell in the courthouse. Or when I threw the bell at him. That too." His expression grew serious. "You saved my life today." "You saved mine the day you walked into my schoolhouse," Abigail replied. "You saved me from a life half-lived, from dying slowly of loneliness and purposelessness." Jonas cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had escaped. "We saved each other then." "A mutual rescue," Abigail agreed and kissed him. Later that night, as they lay in Jonas's bed, their bed now, the master bedroom that Abigail had finally claimed as her own, she traced patterns on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her palm. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous," Jonas murmured sleepily. She pinched him lightly. "I'm serious. With Blackwell gone, with the ranch secure, maybe it's time to think about the future, beyond just survival." Jonas's hand stilled where it had been stroking her hair. What kind of future? The kind with children learning in that rebuilt schoolhouse. The kind where we host harvest dances and Christmas gatherings. The kind where this house is full of life again. "Children," Jonas repeated, and she could hear both hope and fear in his voice. "Only if you want them," Abigail said quickly. "I know losing Sarah." "Sarah's gone," Jonas interrupted gently. "And I'll always carry that grief. But you're here and you're strong, and if we're blessed with children, they'll have you for a mother. That changes everything." "So, you want them children. With you." Jonas pulled her closer. "Yes, I want everything with you." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Elizabeth Bennet arrived with a lawyer from Denver, looking determined and oddly satisfied. "I have news," she announced without preamble. "Marcus Blackwell wants to make a deal." Jonas's expression hardened. "No deals." "Hear me out," Elizabeth insisted. "He's willing to sign over all claims to the disputed land, pay full restitution for the damages, and leave the state permanently. In exchange, you drop the attempted murder charges to assault." "He tried to kill Jonas," Abigail protested. "And he'll still serve time," the lawyer interjected. 5 to 10 years for assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, and arson. But with the attempted murder charge, he's looking at life.
His associates are willing to pay handsomely to avoid that. "Why do you care?" Jonas asked Elizabeth suspiciously. Elizabeth's smile was sharp. "Because Regina Blackwell is my cousin. Didn't you know, my mother's sister's daughter? She's an idiot who married a villain, but she's still family. With Marcus gone for a few years instead of forever, she might have a chance to rebuild her life." "And you think she deserves that chance?" Abigail asked. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," Elizabeth replied, looking directly at Jonas. "Sarah got hers when she married you. You got yours when you married Abigail. Maybe Regina deserves one too." Jonas and Abigail exchanged looks, communicating silently in the way they'd developed over the months of their marriage. Finally, Jonas nodded. 5 conditions, he said. First, Blackwell signs over all water rights, not just land claims. Second, he pays double damages enough to rebuild both burned buildings and compensate my men for their trouble. Third, he leaves the state within 24 hours of his release and never returns. Fourth, Regina publicly apologizes for her false testimony about Sarah. And fifth, he paused, looking at Abigail, who nodded encouragement. Fifth, the Blackwell Ranch schoolhouse gets donated to the county for a proper school with an endowment for a teacher's salary. The lawyer started to protest, but Elizabeth held up a hand. Done. I'll make sure of it. As the documents were drawn up and signed, Abigail pulled Elizabeth aside. Why are you really doing this?
Elizabeth studied her for a moment. Because Sarah would have wanted peace, not endless vengeance. And because I see how you look at Jonas, how he looks at you. You have what Sarah always wanted, a true partnership. Don't let Blackwell's poison taint that. You're a good woman, Elizabeth Bennet. I'm a practical woman, Elizabeth corrected. And I recognize another practical woman when I see one. Be happy, Abigail. Be happy enough for both you and Sarah. The trial was swift, the outcome predetermined by the signed agreements. Blackwell stood sullen and defeated as he was sentenced, Regina weeping beside him. But as they were led away, Regina stopped beside Abigail. I hated you, she said quietly. You had everything I wanted. Respect, purpose, a husband who looked at you like you hung the stars. Marcus never looked at you that way. Regina's laugh was bitter. Marcus only ever loved Marcus. And Sarah. He loved Sarah until it twisted into something poisonous. She straightened, some dignity returning. Take care of Jonas. He's a better man than I gave him credit for. I will, Abigail promised. As they watched the Blackwells being taken to serve their sentences, Jonas wrapped his arm around Abigail's waist. It's really over now. No, Abigail corrected, leaning into his strength. Now it really begins. The ride home was peaceful, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. As they crested the rise that overlooked the ranch, Jonas pulled the horses to a stop. Below them, the ranch spread out like a promise, the new barn rising strong and proud, the house warm with lamplight, the land rolling endless toward the horizon. When I first came to your schoolhouse, Jonas said quietly, I was looking for a business arrangement, a practical solution to a practical problem. And what did you find instead, Puotom? Everything, Jonas said simply. I found everything. As they descended toward home, Abigail thought about the journey that had brought them here from that first shocking proposition to this moment of perfect understanding. She thought about Sarah, hoping the gentle woman had found peace. She thought about Blackwell and Regina beginning their punishment and perhaps their redemption. But mostly she thought about the man beside her, this complicated, wonderful, infuriating man who had offered her a business arrangement and given her love instead. The ranch hands were gathering for evening chores, calling out greetings as they passed. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, smiling her quiet smile. The new barn cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its evening song. Welcome home, Mrs. Cutter, Jonas said, helping her down from the wagon. Welcome home, Mr. Cutter, she replied, and stood on her toes to kiss him, not caring who saw. Inside the house was warm and welcoming. The parlor where they'd first negotiated their arrangement had been transformed. Abigail's books mixed with Jonas's on the shelves. Her mother's quilt draped over his leather chair. Fresh flowers in vases that had gathered dust during the years of Jonas's solitude. That evening, as they prepared for bed in the master bedroom that was truly theirs, now Jonas pulled out a folded paper from his dresser drawer. What's that? Abigail asked, brushing out her hair. Our original agreement, he said, holding up the practical contract they'd signed before the wedding. The one that outlined our business arrangement. Why do you still have that? Instead of answering, Jonas walked to the fireplace and tossed the paper into the flames. They watched together as it burned, the carefully negotiated terms turning to ash. We don't need it anymore, he said simply. What we have can't be contained in contracts or conditions. Abigail moved into his arms, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. What do we have, Jonas? Love. He said the word that had once seemed impossible, now flowing easily from his lips. We have love and partnership and a future that's ours to build. Together, Abigail added. Together. Jonas agreed and kissed her with all the passion that their practical beginning had never promised, but had somehow delivered anyway. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the prairie in pristine white. But inside the Cutter ranch house, warmth and love had taken root, growing stronger with each passing day. The school teacher and the rancher had found in each other not what they'd sought, but what they'd needed, and that made all the difference. The winter that followed was the harshest in a decade, but inside the Cutter ranch house, warmth prevailed. Snow piled against the windows while Abigail and Jonas learned the rhythms of true partnership,
their practical arrangement having bloomed into something neither had dared imagine. It was during one particularly fierce blizzard in January that Abigail first suspected she might be carrying a child. She stood at the kitchen window watching Jonas and the hands struggle through the snow to reach the cattle and pressed a hand to her stomach where a peculiar fluttering sensation had been troubling her for days. Mrs. Chen, ever observant, appeared at her elbow with a cup of ginger tea. "You feeling sick in mornings?" the older woman said. It wasn't a question. Abigail turned to her eyes wide. "How did you know?" "I have eyes. Also, you don't eat breakfast anymore, just push food around plate." Mrs. Chen's smile was knowing. "When did you last have your monthly time?" The question made Abigail blush, but she calculated quickly. 2 months ago, maybe more, but I thought it was just the stress of everything with Blackwell. "Stress don't make you glow like sunrise," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You carrying Mr. Jonas's baby, I'm sure." The certainty in her voice made Abigail sink into a chair, her mind reeling. A baby. After all those years of assuming motherhood had passed her by, after resigning herself to teaching other people's children, she might be carrying her own child. "Don't tell Jonas yet," she said quickly. "I need to be sure. I need to see Doc Morrison." Mrs. Chen nodded. "I keep secret, but not for long. Soon everyone will see." The next morning brought a break in the storm, and Abigail convinced Jonas she needed supplies from town. He wanted to accompany her, but she insisted she'd be fine with Pete as escort, claiming she wanted to surprise him with something special for their upcoming 6-month anniversary. Doc Morrison confirmed what Mrs. Chen had suspected. "About 10 weeks along, I'd say," he announced after his examination. "Everything seems healthy, Mrs. Cutter. You're strong, you're young enough, and you've got good wide hips for birthing." "Young enough?" Abigail laughed nervously. "I'm 33, doctor, and I've delivered babies to women 10 years older," he replied reassuringly. "You'll be fine. The question is, how's Jonas going to handle it?" "After what happened with Sarah." "What about Sarah?" Abigail asked, alarmed. Doc Morrison looked uncomfortable. "She lost 2 babies before the fever took her, early on both times. Jonas never said much, but it broke something in both of them. Sarah became fragile as glass, and Jonas, well, he blamed himself, thought maybe the ranch life was too hard for her." Abigail absorbed this information, understanding now. Another layer of Jonas's grief, another reason he'd chosen a practical arrangement over risking his heart again. The ride home was quiet, her mind turning over how to tell him how to navigate his fears while managing her own. She found him in the study that evening, going over the ranch accounts by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, his face softening into the smile he reserved just for her. "How was town?" he asked, setting aside his pen. "Informative," she said, moving to stand behind his chair, her hands on his shoulders. "Jonas, I need to tell you something." He tensed immediately, turning to look up at her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she assured him quickly. "In fact, something's very right. Jonas," she took a breath, "I'm carrying our child." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Jonas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, something that might have been joy, then fear again. He stood slowly, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "You're certain?" Doc Morrison confirmed it today, 10 weeks along. His hand slid down to hover over her still flat stomach, not quite touching, as if afraid she might shatter. "A baby," he whispered, and she heard everything in those 2 words, hope and terror, in equal measure. "I know about Sarah," she said gently. "Doc Morrison told me about the losses." Jonas's face crumpled for a moment before he pulled her against him, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I can't lose you," he said roughly into her hair. "I won't survive it, Abigail. I won't." "You won't lose me," she promised, though she knew it was a promise no one could truly make. "I'm not Sarah Jonas. I'm strong. I'm healthy. And I'm stubborn as a mule. This baby and I are going to be fine." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "You're happy about this?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But yes, happy. Are you?" "I'm everything," he said, laughing shakily. "Happy, terrified, amazed, grateful. God, Abigail, we're going to have a baby." The next months passed in a blur of preparation and careful watching. Jonas became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, until Abigail firmly reminded him that she'd been hauling water and wood for years before meeting him. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said one morning when he tried to stop her from gardening. "Fresh air and gentle exercise are good for me and the baby." "Sarah always said," he began, then stopped, looking stricken. "I'm not Sarah," Abigail said gently but firmly, "and this is not her pregnancy. This is ours, yours and mine, and this child's. We write our own story, Jonas." It was during her 5th month, when her condition could no longer be hidden by clever dressing, that Elizabeth Bennet returned for a visit. She took one look at Abigail's rounded belly and burst into tears. "Sarah always wanted children," she said, accepting the handkerchief Abigail offered. It would have broken her heart, but also made her happy to see Jonas have what she couldn't give him. "Tell me about her pregnancies," Abigail requested. "Jonas won't speak of it, and I need to understand." Elizabeth composed herself, settling into the parlor chair with her tea. The first time she was so happy, she decorated the nursery-knitted tiny clothes, chose names. When she lost the baby at 3 months, something in her dimmed. The second time, she was cautiously hopeful. When that baby was lost too, she became convinced she was cursed, that God was punishing her for marrying Jonas when she loved Marcus. She told you that in her fever dreams at the end. She rambled about many things, but Marcus's name came up often. Elizabeth studied Abigail shrewdly. "Does that bother you, that she loved another?" "No," Abigail said honestly. "It makes me sad for all of them. Sarah loving Marcus but choosing duty, Jonas loving Sarah but unable to make her happy, Marcus turning bitter and violent from rejection. So much pain from mismatched love. And you and Jonas, we matched from the start," Abigail said simply. "We just didn't know it. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new calves, and with it came a letter that changed everything. It was addressed to Jonas from a law firm in Denver, and his face went white as he read it. "What is it?" Abigail asked, alarmed. "Marcus Blackwell is dead," Jonas said numbly. "Killed in a prison fight 2 days ago." Abigail sank into a chair, one hand on her swollen belly, where the baby kicked restlessly. "Oh, Jonas. There's more. Regina was already released early for good behavior. She's left the state, gone back east to live with relatives. And," he looked up at her, "Marcus left the ranch to you." "What to me?" "His final joke, I suppose. Or maybe his twisted idea of justice. The letter says he wanted the schoolteacher to have what she'd earned with her cleverness." Jonas's jaw clenched. "We don't have to accept it." But Abigail was already thinking, her practical mind working through possibilities. "The schoolhouse endowment, is it still valid?" "I believe so. Why?" "Because we could honor that agreement. Build a proper school, hire teachers, create something good from all that pain." She met his eyes. "Sarah wanted to teach. I've always wanted to teach. Maybe this is a way to honor both dreams." Jonas crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "You constantly amaze me," he said. "Most women would want nothing to do with anything connected to Blackwell." "I'm not most women," Abigail reminded him with a slight smile. "Besides, Regina deserves to know something positive came from her husband's legacy, even if he intended it as an insult." The legal transfer took weeks to complete, but by early June, Abigail stood in what had been the Blackwell Ranch House, now designated as the Prairie Rose Academy for local children. The name had been Jonas's suggestion, prairie for the land they all shared, rose for Sarah's favorite flower. "You think she would have approved?" he asked, standing beside her as they watched workmen installing desks and blackboards. "I think she would have loved it," Abigail said, taking his hand and placing it on her belly, where their child tumbled and kicked. Life moving forward, children learning the future, being built on the foundational stones of the past. It was there, in that repurposed room where so much plotting and hatred had been born, that Abigail's water broke 6 weeks early. The irony wasn't lost on her as Jonas frantically loaded her into the wagon racing for town, and Doc Morrison, while she gripped the seat and tried to breathe through contractions that seemed impossibly strong. "Too early," she gasped. Jonas, it's too early. You're strong, he said, though his knuckles were white on the reins. You're the strongest person I know. You and this baby are going to be fine. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the next day. Jonas never left her side, letting her crush his hand through each contraction, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she wanted to give up. I can't, she sobbed at one point, exhausted beyond measure. Jonas, I can't do this. Yes, you can, he said fiercely. You threw a bell at an armed man. You faced down the entire town's gossip. You turned a business arrangement into love. You can do anything, Abigail Cutter. Doc Morrison was growing concerned as the second night approached. The baby's turned wrong, he admitted quietly to Jonas. I might have to… No, Abigail interrupted, having heard despite their whispers. Don't you dare give up on us, Doctor. This baby and I have come too far to quit now. Whether it was determination or divine intervention, the baby finally turned just as the sun began to rise. 3 pushes later, a small but perfect son entered the world, his cry thin but strong. He's small, Doc Morrison said, placing the baby on Abigail's chest. But his lungs are certainly working. Jonas was crying openly, touching his son's tiny head with one trembling finger. He's perfect. Abigail, he's perfect. What should we call him? She asked, exhausted but euphoric. Jonas looked at her, then at their son, then out the window where the dawn was painting the prairie gold. Samuel, he said softly. Samuel means God has heard. Because every prayer I never knew I was praying has been answered. Samuel Jonas Cutter, Abigail agreed, then added with a tired smile, though if he inherits your stubbornness and my tendency to throw things, we're in for trouble. The recovery was slow but steady. The baby, despite his early arrival, thrived under the careful attention of his parents and the devoted care of Mrs. Chen, who declared him the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen and dared anyone to disagree. It was during those quiet weeks of recovery that the ranch truly became home in a way it hadn't before. Jonas moved his office to the bedroom so he could work while Abigail and Samuel rested. The ranch hands took turns bringing wildflower bouquets and carved toys for the baby. Even Pete Rodriguez, tough as leather and twice as weathered, was caught singing Spanish lullabies to Samuel when he thought no one was watching. The Prairie Rose Academy opened that September with 23 students and 2 teachers, a young woman from Denver, and a retired professor from Chicago who'd come west for his health. Abigail, with Samuel in a sling across her chest, gave the opening address. Education is the gift that poverty cannot steal and misfortune cannot break, she said, looking out at the assembled crowd, ranch families, townspeople, even some who'd traveled from neighboring counties. This school stands as proof that from conflict can come cooperation, from loss can come learning, and from the ashes of old dreams can rise new hope. Regina Blackwell sent a letter that arrived the day after the opening. It was brief but poignant. I heard what you've done with the ranch. Marcus would have hated it, which means it's probably exactly right. Thank you for finding something good in all that waste. May your children grow up without the poison of their parents' mistakes. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, the Cutter Ranch thrived. The cattle were fat and healthy, the new barn stood strong against the first winter storms, and the house rang with the sound of Samuel's laughter as he learned to crawl, leaving chaos in his wake. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Jonas found Abigail in the nursery, the room that had waited so long to fulfill its purpose. She was in the rocking chair Sarah had chosen, but never used Samuel sleeping in her arms, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung. You're beautiful, he said from the doorway. I'm exhausted, she corrected with a laugh. Samuel's teething, and I haven't slept properly in days. Jonas crossed to them, lifting Samuel gently from her arms and settling him in his crib. Then he pulled Abigail to her feet and into his embrace. Do you remember, he said quietly, when I came to your schoolhouse with that absurd proposition, when you declared I needed strong sons to guard my winters? She teased. Well, you have one strong son so far, Jonas pointed out, though he seems more interested in eating his toes than guarding anything. Give him time, Abigail said, leaning into his warmth. Besides, I rather like having my winters guarded by you.
just your winters. All my seasons, she amended, lifting her face for his kiss. As they stood there in the nursery, snow falling softly outside, their son sleeping peacefully in his crib, Abigail thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first shocking proposition to this moment of perfect contentment, every step had been unexpected, sometimes difficult, occasionally dangerous, but ultimately right. I love you, Tad, Jonas said against her hair. I love you more than I thought possible to love anyone. You've given me a second chance at life, at happiness, at family. We gave each other that chance, Abigail corrected. That's what partnerships do. A cry from the crib interrupted them. Samuel, awake and demanding attention with all the imperious certainty of a 6-month-old tyrant. As Abigail lifted him, soothing his fussing with practiced ease, Jonas wrapped his arms around them both. My family, he said wonderingly, as if still amazed by the reality of it. The next spring brought news that felt like the closing of a circle. Elizabeth Bennet wrote to say she was getting married to a widower with 3 children who needed a mother. You showed me that practical arrangements can become profound love, she wrote. I'm following your example and saying yes to possibility. They attended the wedding in Denver, Samuel charming everyone with his newly acquired ability to walk stumbling from guest to guest, with determination that reminded everyone of his mother. During the reception, Elizabeth pulled Abigail aside. I have something for you, she said, producing a leather journal. Sarah's last diary, the one I didn't show at the trial. I thought you should have it. Abigail opened it carefully, seeing Sarah's delicate handwriting. The entries were from her final months, and one in particular stood out. I dreamed last night that Jonas remarried. His new wife was plain but strong, practical but kind. She made him laugh, really laugh, not the polite sound he makes for me. She gave him children who climbed on his shoulders and called him Papa with love, not duty. I woke crying not from jealousy but from relief. If I cannot give him happiness, I pray God sends someone who can. He deserves to be loved for who he is, not who I wish he were. Abigail closed the diary, tears streaming down her face. She saw me, she whispered. Somehow she saw me coming. That night in their hotel room with Samuel finally asleep in his crib, Abigail showed Jonas the diary entry. He read it in silence, then pulled her against him, both of them crying for the woman who had loved enough to wish for her husband's future happiness, even as she faced her own ending. She was better than any of us knew, Jonas said finally. They all were. Abigail replied, thinking of Marcus's final bitter gift that had become a school of Regina's grace in defeat of Elizabeth's determination to see love prevail over loss. Summer arrived with abundance, the ranch prospering, the school thriving. Samuel taking his first real steps in the garden while chasing a patient barn cat. It was then that Abigail realized she was pregnant again this time, greeting the news with joy untinged by fear. Another baby, Jonas said when she told him, his face bright with uncomplicated happiness. Samuel will have a sibling. Maybe that sister you mentioned, Abigail teased. Someone to help guard those winters. This pregnancy was easier perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because the shadow of the past no longer loomed so large. The birth when it came in early spring was swift and uncomplicated. A daughter this time, with Jonas's gray eyes and Abigail's determined chin. What should we call her? Jonas asked, cradling the tiny bundle while Samuel peered curiously at his new sister. Grace, Abigail said firmly. Because that's what this life has given us, grace we didn't earn, couldn't have imagined but received anyway. Grace Sarah Cutter, Jonas added softly, and Abigail nodded, understanding the tribute and accepting it. As spring turned to summer, the prairie bloomed with unusual abundance. The garden Abigail had coaxed from the difficult soil produced vegetables enough to share with half the county. The school graduated its first class with 3 students accepted to colleges back east. The ranch turned its best profit in a decade. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Samuel chase fireflies while Grace slept in Abigail's arms, Jonas said, I've been thinking about our beginning. Our practical arrangement. Abigail smiled at the memory. I told you that you needed strong sons to guard your winters, he recalled. But I was wrong. Oh, you never needed guarding, Jonas said, taking her free hand in his. You were always strong enough to guard yourself. What you needed was someone to share the watch with. And what did you need? Abigail asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment, watching their son laugh with pure joy as a firefly landed on his nose. I needed someone to remind me that life is for living, not just surviving, that love isn't weakness, but strength, that second chances aren't betrayals of the past, but honors to it. We both needed each other, Abigail said simply. Just not in the ways we thought. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway.
Mr. Jonas, Mrs. Abigail, supper ready. I made Samuel's favorite. Dumplings! Samuel shrieked, abandoning his firefly chase to race toward the house. As they rose to follow their son inside, Jonas stopped Abigail with a gentle hand on her arm. Thank you, he said simply, for saying yes to my absurd proposition, for seeing past my walls, for giving me this life I never dared dream of. Thank you, she replied, for seeing me when I'd become invisible even to myself, for offering partnership and delivering love, for these children, this home, this future we built from such practical beginnings. Inside their home glowed with lamplight and rang with laughter. Samuel was already at the table drumming his spoon impatiently while Mrs. Chen pretended to scold him. Grace stirred in Abigail's arms, making the small sounds that preceded demands for milk. The ranch hands could be heard in the yard ending their day's work with jokes and plans for tomorrow. This was her life now, not the solitary existence of a spinster schoolteacher, not the cold arrangement of a business marriage, but something richer and stranger and more wonderful than any story she could have imagined. The giant cowboy who had declared his need for a wife had become the love of her life. The lonely teacher who had needed strong sons had become the heart of a thriving family. As they entered their home together, the door closing behind them against the cooling evening air, Abigail thought she heard something on the wind. Perhaps Sarah's laugh, free and joyful at last, or perhaps just the prairie grass singing its eternal song of endurance and hope. Either way, she was home. They all were, finally and forever, home. The seasons turned as seasons do, and the Cutter Ranch stood strong against winter storms and summer droughts alike. Samuel grew tall and serious like his father, but with his mother's quick wit. Grace became a force of nature, charming and determined in equal measure. 2 more children followed twin boys who arrived during a blizzard and seemed determined to maintain that level of drama throughout their childhoods. The Prairie Rose Academy became a model for rural education, drawing visitors from as far as San Francisco to see how a frontier school could match any Eastern institution. Abigail returned to teaching when the youngest twins turned 3, not from need, but from love of the work. Jonas's hair went completely silver, though he claimed Abigail and the children were entirely responsible. Abigail's own hair showed streaks of gray that she wore proudly badges of honor from a life fully lived. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jonas surprised her by having the old schoolhouse in town rebuilt and dedicated as the Abigail Cutter Library, stating that a woman who had used books to save a ranch deserved to have her name on a building full of them. "You impossible romantic," she accused him, tears streaming down her face as the town gathered for the dedication. "I learned from the best," he replied, kissing her soundly in front of the entire population of Red Fern Ridge. They grew old together, not gently, but fiercely fighting for their land, their children, their community with the same partnership that had begun with such practical considerations. When Jonas's heart began to fail at 70, Abigail nursed him with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in their shared life. "No dying," she commanded him one particularly bad night. "We have grandchildren to meet, weddings to attend, more anniversaries to celebrate." Bossy woman. He wheezed, but he rallied, giving them 5 more years. When he finally went, it was peacefully in their bed with Abigail holding his hand and their children surrounding them. His last words were, "Thank you for saying yes." Abigail lived another 7 years, long enough to see Samuel become a judge, Grace a doctor, the twins successful ranchers in their own right. She continued teaching until the very end, her final lesson delivered from her bed to her gathered grandchildren just days before she joined Jonas. "Love isn't always what you expect," she told them, her voice still strong despite her frailty. "Sometimes it comes dressed as duty. Sometimes it arrives as a business proposition. Sometimes it grows so slowly you don't notice until it's become the air you breathe. But always, always, it's worth the risk." They buried her beside Jonas in the cemetery she used to visit when she was lonely, reading the headstones of strangers. Now she lay among family, her stone reading simply, Abigail Cutter, beloved wife, mother teacher. She said yes. And in the spring that followed, the prairie roses bloomed more abundantly than anyone could remember, as if the earth itself celebrated a love that had begun with such practical intentions and ended with such profound grace.